The auctioneer's voice was a gravelly rasp, worn thin by dust and a lifetime of hollering over the rumble of diesel engines. It was the summer of 1969, and the air at the Miller Farm dispersal was thick with the smell of sun-baked earth, hot steel, and the faint, sweet decay of last year's hay, rotting in a forgotten corner of the barn. Men in sweat-stained seed corn caps stood in tight knots, their arms crossed, their faces grim masks of calculation. An auction was a funeral of sorts, a public dissection of a man's life and failures, and every farmer there was picking over the bones, hoping to find a bargain that would stave off their own eventual reckoning. I stood at the back, away from the main crowd, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jeans. My name is Silas Blackwood. I was 24 years old, and I farmed the 80 acres my father had left me, 80 acres of the hilliest, rockiest, most stubborn ground in Pike County. My inheritance was the land, a drafty farmhouse, a solid but ancient farm all-em that Dad had bought new after the war, and a deeply ingrained suspicion of banks. The main event was over. The big tractors, the John Deere 40s and 10, and the nearly new International 856 had been sold for prices that made me wince. Earl Thompson, whose father owned half the county and had co-signed on the other half, had bought the International. He didn't need it, not really. He already had a new 1256 with the turbo whine that you could hear 2 miles away. Buying the 856 was just a show of force, a way of marking his territory. He stood by it now, slapping its big rear fender, a smug grin on his face as a few other young farmers gathered around to admire his conquest. "Gonna put jewels on her, Earl?" one of them asked, his voice full of envy. "Might," Earl said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Banker says I ought to trade up for one of them new 4-wheel drive Deeres next year. Says a man's got to expand or die." He shot a look over the crowd, and his eyes landed on me for a second. A flicker of contempt crossed his face before he turned back to his audience. We'd grown up together, but we'd never been friends. His world was one of easy credit and endless expansion. My world was one of patching old tires, welding cracked implements, and making do. The auctioneer, Billy Ray Stimson, was moving on to the scrap line now, the row of rusted, forgotten iron that had been dragged out from behind the barn. A set of worn-out cultivators went for $10. A hay rake with 3 missing teeth went for $15. The crowd was thinning out, the serious buyers heading for their pickups. Then Billy Ray stopped in front of it. It was an Alice Chalmers HD7 crawler, a bulldozer from another era. It wasn't just old, it was petrified. A decade of sitting in the weeds had bleached its Persian orange paint to a pale, leprous pink. Rust had eaten holes clean through the engine covers. A thicket of blackberry briars grew up through the operator's platform, and one of the heavy tracks lay slack and broken, like a snapped chain. It sat there under the hot sun, a 10-ton monument to failure. "All right, boys, what am I bid for this fine piece of lawn art?" Billy Ray croaked, a smirk on his face. "She was running when parked," old man Miller told me. Of course, that was about the time Kennedy was in office. A wave of laughter rippled through the remaining farmers. "Look at that engine," someone muttered near me. "That's one of them Screamin' Jimmies, a 371. Bet she's seized up tighter than a banker's fist." "You couldn't move that thing with dynamite," another added. Earl Thompson swaggered over, kicking one of the solid steel track pads. It didn't budge, but the clang of his boot against the metal was loud in the quiet afternoon. "What's the matter, Billy Ray?" Earl called out. "Can't get a bid? I'll give you $50 for the scrap value." He winked at his friends. "My new corn planter weighs more than this heap." More laughter. Billy Ray ignored him. $50 bid from Mr. Thompson. "Do I hear 60? $60, boys, come on now. There's $50 worth of bolts on it if you got the torch to cut 'em off." Silence. The men shuffled their feet. They were looking at a problem, a massive, immovable, expensive problem. I was looking at something else. I saw the straight, unbent frame. I saw the blade, heavy and thick, with a good cutting edge still visible beneath the rust. I saw the Detroit diesel engine, a legendary power plant that, if it could be brought back to life, was damn near indestructible. My father had always said, "Son, don't look at what a thing is, look at what it can be." On our farm, the rocks were our curse. Every spring, the frost heave would push a fresh crop of them to the surface, fieldstones ranging from the size of a fist to the size of a small calf. They broke plowshares, bent disc axles, and made planting a nightmare. For 2 generations, the Blackwood men had fought them with pry bars, stone boats, and aching backs. That Dozer was the answer to a prayer I'd never dared to speak aloud. $60, I said. My voice was quiet, but in the lull, it carried like a gunshot. Every head turned. Earl Thompson spun around, his jaw dropping for a second, before his face broke into a wide, mocking grin. "Well, look what we got here," he boomed. "Silas Blackwood's going to be a construction magnate. What are you going to do with that thing, Silas? Push over your own corn stalks." His buddies howled. I kept my eyes on the auctioneer, my face a stone mask. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, but I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I got $60 from the young man in the back," Billy Ray announced, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Do I hear 70? 75? Earl just laughed and shook his head, turning his back on me, as if the matter was too ridiculous to warrant his attention. "Sold!" Billy Ray's gavel, a worn piece of oak, cracked against his palm. "To Silas Blackwood for $60. The deal was done. The laughter died down into a low murmur of disbelief. As I walked forward to pay the clerk, I could hear them. Lost his mind. Got more money than sense, and he ain't got no money. That thing'll be sittin' in his yard till he's old and grey. I handed the clerk 3 worn $20 bills, the last of the cash I had on me. She gave me a receipt and a look that was a mixture of pity and confusion. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. Then I walked over to my purchase. Up close, it was even more intimidating. I laid a hand on the rusty track. The steel was warm from the sun. I looked at the seized engine, the broken track, the rust-pitted blade. It was a mountain of work, a fool's errand. For a moment, a cold wave of doubt washed over me. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had just thrown away $60 I couldn't afford to lose on a pile of junk. But then I looked past the Dozer, across the fields, to the hazy blue line of the hills where my own 80 acres lay waiting. I pictured the rock-strewn slopes, the gullies that washed out with every heavy rain, the patches of ground too poor to grow anything but weeds. And I saw what this machine could do. Not just for the land, but for me. It was a declaration of independence, a $60 bet on myself against the world. Now, before we go any further with this story, I need to ask you folks listening something. Have you ever stood in front of a piece of machinery, a car, a tool, anything that everyone else called worthless scrap? Something everybody laughed at you for buying. But you, and only you, could see the heart of solid steel beating under all that rust and ruin. Drop a comment below and tell me what it was and how the story ended. I'd sure like to hear I'm not the only stubborn fool out there. Getting the HD7 home was the first humiliation. It weighed close to 20,000 pounds. My Farmel M couldn't dream of pulling it, and it sure as hell wasn't going to roll. I had to call Marvin Peters, who owned the only lowboy trailer in the county. Marvin was a good man, but his price was firm. $150. More than twice what I'd paid for the Dozer itself. My stomach churned as I wrote him the check, draining my meager bank account down to almost nothing. The day Marvin came to move, it was a public spectacle. It seemed like half the county found a reason to drive by the Miller place. I saw Earl Thompson's shiny new Ford F-250 slow down as it passed, his elbow hanging out the window, a cloud of dust trailing behind him. He didn't wave. He just shook his head slowly, a condescending smile on his face. Marvin and I worked for 3 hours under the blistering sun. The Dozer's brakes were frozen solid, and the broken track was a tangled mess. We used heavy chains, a come-along, and every curse word we both knew. The main winch on Marvin's truck groaned and smoked, the cable stretched taut as a guitar string. Finally, with a shriek of tortured metal, the old Alice Chalmers scraped its way up the ramps and settled onto the trailer bed with a shudder that shook the ground. When we got it to my farm, the only place to put it was in the yard between the house and the barn. It looked even worse there, a hunk of industrial ruin squatting on the patch of grass my mother had tried so hard to cultivate. It was an eyesore, and a constant, looming reminder of the impossible task I had set for myself. For the first month, I did nothing but look at it. I had to get my soybeans harvested. I spent my days on the seat of the old farmel, pulling my 2-row Alice Chalmers 60X combine, listening to its familiar clatter, and my nights worrying about the silent beast in my yard. Once the crops were in, and the first chill of autumn was in the air, the real work began. The engine was the heart of the matter. The Detroit 371 was a 2-stroke diesel, a design that was both brutally simple and notoriously finicky. And as the coffee shop experts had predicted, it was seized solid. I pulled the valve cover, a greasy, heavy piece of cast iron. The rockers and valves were coated in a thick, black sludge that was the consistency of tar. I pulled the big injectors, each one the size of a beer bottle, and peered down into the cylinders. Darkness. My first move was to try and break it loose. I poured a gallon of a concoction my father had sworn by, a 50-50 mix of diesel fuel and automatic transmission fluid, down into the injector holes, hoping it would seep past the piston rings and dissolve the rust that was welding them to the cylinder liners. I let it sit for a week, adding more each day. Then came the moment of truth. The front of the crankshaft had a massive nut on it. I found a 2-inch socket in my father's old toolbox that fit, and I put it on a 3-foot-long breaker bar. I put all my weight on it. Nothing. It was like trying to turn the earth itself. I got a 6-foot length of heavy steel pipe and slipped it over the breaker bar for more leverage. I leaned into it, my muscles straining, my boots slipping on the oily ground. A groan. Not from the engine, but from the breaker bar as it started to bend under the immense pressure. I stopped, my heart pounding. If I snapped that socket, or, God forbid, the end of the crankshaft, the project was over before it started. The community scorn was a constant, low-grade fever. When I went to the parts store in town for gaskets and filters, Sam, the owner, would look at the part number and then at me over the top of his spectacles. "This is for an old Alice crawler, ain't it, Silas? You still messin' with that thing?" The other farmers at the counter would stop their conversations and listen, a few of them smirking. I learned to just nod, pay for my parts, and leave. The worst part was the drive-bys. Earl Thompson seemed to have a sixth sense for when I was at my lowest point. I'd be wrestling with a rusted bolt, covered in grease and frustration, and I'd hear the sound of his pickup slowing on the road. He'd just pause there for a minute, long enough for me to see him before speeding off. It was a silent, constant judgment. Winter set in. I moved on to the track. Splitting a Dozer track is a job for a specialized hydraulic press and a team of men. I had neither. The master pin, the one pin that holds the two ends of the track together, was a solid cylinder of hardened steel 4 inches in diameter, and it was rusted into place with the force of a geologic event. I spent a week building a makeshift press out of a 20-ton bottle jack and some heavy I-beams I salvaged from a collapsed bridge. I heated the track link around the pin with a cutting torch until it glowed cherry red, the metal popping and hissing. Then I'd pump the jack, putting thousands of pounds of pressure on the pin. For days, nothing happened. The I-beam would bend, the jack would groan, but the pin wouldn't move. On the 4th day, in the bitter cold of a late November afternoon, I had the link glowing and the jack pumped as tight as it would go. I took a 16-pound sledgehammer and, with a scream of pure frustration, I hit the end of the jack's ram. The sound was like a cannon shot. A deafening crack echoed across the valley. The master pin shot out of the link like a bullet, ricocheted off the barn wall, and buried itself 6 inches deep in the frozen ground 20 feet away. The tension released so violently that the entire press assembly flew apart. I was thrown backward, landing hard in the dirt, my ears ringing. For a minute I just lay there, the freezing air searing my lungs, staring up at the grey sky. Then I started to laugh, a wild, ragged, victorious laugh. I had won. The next few years settled into a rhythm of grinding, relentless work. By the spring of 1972, the Dozer was no longer a static monument, but a living, breathing machine. I had managed to free the engine. It took 3 months of soaking, patient turning, and eventually pulling the head to manually clean the rust from the cylinder walls. I honed the liners myself, rebuilt the fuel system, and rewired the entire machine. The first time I fired it up is a memory burned into my soul. I bled the fuel lines, checked the oil, and hit the starter button. The big electric starter motor groaned, turning the massive engine over slowly. 1 revolution. 2. Then a puff of white smoke coughed from the straight pipe exhaust. Another revolution, and another puff, this one darker. And then, with a thunderous roar that shook the windows in the farmhouse, the 371 Detroit diesel roared to life. It wasn't a smooth, rumbling idle like a 4-stroke engine. It was a screaming, clattering, angry racket, a 2-stroke symphony of power. It filled the air with a cloud of blue smoke that smelled of unburnt diesel and victory. I climbed onto the steel seat, my hands trembling slightly as I grabbed the steering clutches. The beast was alive. While I had been resurrecting my iron monster, the world outside my farm had gone crazy. The Russians had a bad harvest, and President Nixon opened up trade. The Great Grain Robbery, they called it later. But at the time, all we knew was that corn and soybean prices were shooting for the moon. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butts, was telling us to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Get big or get out. Credit was cheap, and land prices were soaring. It was a golden age for men like Earl Thompson. He became the poster boy for the new era of farming. He bought the 160 acres that bordered my property to the west, paying a price per acre that would have been unthinkable just 5 years earlier. The first thing he did was bring in a professional crew with 2 brand new Caterpillar D8s. In 1 week, they tore out every tree, every fence row, every bit of wildlife habitat that had been there for 100 years. They filled in the waterways and leveled the gentle hills, creating a massive, flat, featureless field. Then the new equipment arrived. A John Deere 4630, the king of the two-wheel drive tractors, complete with the revolutionary Sound Guard cab. It had air conditioning, a radio, and a tinted windshield. Earl would sit up there in his clean little bubble, listening to the radio while his 8-bottom plough tore through the earth. He bought a new Gleaner L combine with a 20-foot grain head that could harvest more in an hour than I could in a day. He was hailed as a visionary, a progressive, a man who was feeding the world. And what was I doing? I was out on my own rocky hillsides with my noisy, smoky, ancient HD7. But I wasn't clearing land for more crops. I was improving the land I already had. I started on the worst field, a 20-acre slope so riddled with rocks you could barely walk across it. Day after day, I'd drop the heavy blade and push. The dozer would buck and shudder as the steel edge hit a buried boulder. I'd have to work it back and forth, digging around the rock until I could get the blade under it and use the machine's immense torque to pry it from the earth's grip. Some of them were the size of my tractor. I pushed them all into massive piles at the edge of the field, creating stone walls my ancestors would have recognized. Then I started building terraces. Using the dozer's blade, I carefully carved long, wide ridges into the hillside, following the contour of the land. These terraces would catch the rainwater, preventing the topsoil from washing away into the creek below. It was slow, painstaking work. Earl could plough 100 acres in the time it took me to build one good terrace. The coffee shop talk shifted from mocking my folly to questioning my sanity. Prices are at an all-time high, and Silas Blackwood is out there making rock piles, they'd say. He's playing in the dirt with that old toy while Earl's buying a new Cadillac. They were right. Earl was making a fortune on paper. The value of his land was skyrocketing, and the bank was eager to lend him more money against it. He built a new machine shed, a massive steel structure that dwarfed my old wooden barn. He and his wife took a vacation to Hawaii. I, on the other hand, was barely scraping by. I wasn't borrowing money, but I wasn't making much either. I sold just enough grain to pay my property taxes and buy fuel and groceries. Every spare dollar and every spare hour went back into the land. I dug a deep pond at the bottom of a watershed to catch the runoff, a reservoir for dry spells. I cleared brush. I fixed gullies. I was healing my 80 acres, while the rest of the world was mortgaging their future to rip theirs apart. One evening in the fall of '74, I was working late, pushing the last of the rocks out of the north pasture. The sun had set, and the only light was the single yellow headlight on the dozer, cutting a shaky beam through the dust and gathering dark. The air was cool and smelled of diesel exhaust and damp earth. I shut the machine down, and the sudden silence was overwhelming, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the metallic ticking of the cooling engine. Across the valley, on the ridge that used to be the old Miller farm, a set of massive floodlights blazed to life, turning the night into an artificial day. I could hear the distant rumble of Earl's new Gleaner combine, the sound of its big diesel engine chewing through another 100 acres of corn, working around the clock to bring in the harvest. As I watched, a pair of headlights turned off the main road and drove up Earl's long gravel driveway. It wasn't a pickup truck. It was a dark sedan, a banker's car. Earlier that day, listening to the noon report on the radio in my workshop, I'd heard a brief story I barely paid attention to at the time. Something about the Federal Reserve raising interest rates to fight inflation. It was just a small bump, the announcer had said, nothing to worry about. But standing there in the dark, watching that banker's car pull up to Earl's brightly lit empire of debt, a cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The good times felt loud, brittle, and blindingly bright. My quiet, debt-free, hard-won kingdom of rock and earth suddenly felt like the only solid thing in the whole world. The good times lasted for nearly a decade, a long, hot summer of prosperity that felt like it would never end. The price of corn flirted with $3 a bushel, then $4. Soybeans were a gold mine. The bankers in town stopped wearing suits and started wearing cowboy boots, handing out money with a smile and a slap on the back. It was the age of expansion, and the gospel of get big or get out was preached from the co-op to the Capitol building. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a headline in the paper or a number on the Board of Trade. It was the sky. The summer of 1978 started dry and stayed dry. The spring rains never came. By June, the corn on the flat, open ground was already showing stress, the leaves curling inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. By July, the creeks had shrunk to a trickle, and the ponds on most farms were muddy saucers ringed with cracked earth. My land, however, was different. The terraces I had painstakingly carved into the hillsides with the old HD7 did their job. What little rain we got they held, letting it soak deep into the soil instead of running off in a muddy torrent. The pond I had dug at the base of the watershed, a project that had earned me more than a few chuckles, was still half full, a cool green jewel in a parched landscape. I ran a long pipe from it to a traveling irrigator, and while my neighbor's corn turned a sickly yellow-brown, mine stayed a deep, healthy green. Earl Thompson's farm, the vast, consolidated prairie he had manufactured next door, suffered the worst. Without fence rows to slow the wind or terraces to hold the water, his topsoil just baked and blew away. I'd watch the dust devils dance across his fields in the afternoon, carrying away the very earth he'd gone so deep in debt to acquire. The real trouble for Earl started in August, during the peak of the heat wave. I was on the ridge, greasing the pins on the Dozer's blade, when I heard a sound from his property that was all wrong. It was his big John Deere 4630, but instead of the steady, powerful roar of its turbocharged engine, there was a high-pitched scream, followed by a loud bang and a plume of black smoke. Then, silence. A few days later, I saw the John Deere dealership's service truck parked in his yard. It was there for 3 days. I heard later at the parts store that the turbo had failed, sending pieces of the turbine wheel through the entire engine. It was a catastrophic failure. The bill, they whispered, was over $10,000. A new engine shipped from Waterloo, Iowa, plus the labor to install it. It was more than I'd made in the entire previous year. That fall, the drought broke, just in time for a wet, miserable harvest. Earl's yield was less than half of what he'd projected. My yield was down too, but not by much. The real difference was, when my old Alice Chalmers combine broke down, and it did, shearing a drive chain for the grain elevator, I went to my workshop, found the right link in a coffee can full of old chain parts, and had it fixed with a punch and a hammer in under an hour. My repair cost me nothing but time. Earl's repair had cost him the price of a small farm. The cracks in his empire began to show. He traded his wife's new Cadillac for a sensible Ford sedan. He put off building the new grain leg he'd been bragging about. The confident swagger he always had was gone, replaced by a permanent frown etched between his eyebrows. He stopped making his slow, taunting drive-bys past my farm. Now, when he drove by, he just stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. The real storm, the one that would wash away men like Earl Thompson, didn't come from the sky. It came from Washington, D.C. First, in 1980, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been selling for $4 a bushel was suddenly worth $2.25, if you could even find a buyer. But the killing blow came from the Federal Reserve. To fight the runaway inflation that had plagued the country, the chairman, a man named Paul Volcker, did the unthinkable. He raised interest rates. Not by a little, but by a lot. They climbed to 10%, then 15%, then past 20%. For a man like me, who owed nothing, it was just a news story. For a man like Earl, whose entire operation was built on a mountain of variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. The math was brutal and simple. The money he had borrowed at 7% was now costing him 21%. The payments on his land and equipment tripled overnight. At the same time, the value of his crops was cut in half. He was being squeezed from both ends, a vice tightening with each passing day. The value of his land, the collateral that had secured all those loans, began to plummet as farmers all over the Midwest started going under. The banker who had been his best friend now refused to even take his calls. The spring of 1982 was the quietest I ever remember. The frantic roar of big tractors preparing the fields was replaced by an eerie stillness. You started seeing them parked in the weeds, the brand new combines and four-wheel drive tractors with grass growing up around their giant tires. They were monuments to a dream that had died. The newspapers were full of foreclosure notices. Farm auctions weren't a rarity anymore. There were 2 or 3 a week. They weren't social events either. They were funerals, attended by grim-faced men who watched their neighbors' lives being sold off piece by piece, all of them wondering when their own turn would come. I survived. I did more than survive. I was stable. My lack of debt was a fortress. My old simple machinery was a blessing. I could fix it myself, and it didn't owe the bank a dime. The land itself, the 80 acres I had poured my sweat and soul into, took care of me. The terraces held the soil, the pond held the water, and the fields, healed and respected, produced. Not record yields, but honest yields. Enough. One afternoon, I saw Earl out in his yard, standing by his silent, gleaming Gleaner combine. He wasn't working on it. He was just standing there, one hand resting on a huge rear tire, his head bowed. He looked smaller, diminished, like the air had been let out of him. His wife came out of the house and said something to him. He didn't answer. He just shook his head and walked away toward the vast, empty fields he no longer truly owned. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom he had already lost. A few weeks later, the notice appeared in the paper. A full-page ad, stark black letters on cheap newsprint. Public auction. By order of the Pike County Agricultural Bank. The property of Earl and Sandra Thompson. Tractors, combine, implements, tools, and 320 acres of prime farmland. Everything. It was all going on the block. The day of the auction was cold and grey for a day in early May, with a sharp wind that rattled the bare branches of the oak trees. It felt fitting. The crowd was huge, bigger than the one at the Miller auction all those years ago. But the mood was completely different. There was no excitement, no thrill of the bargain hunt. There was only a profound, collective sadness. These were not strangers picking over the bones. This was a community watching one of its own being publicly executed by the economy. I saw Earl only once. He was standing near the back of his massive, empty machine shed, half hidden in the shadows. His face was pale and drawn. He looked 10 years older than he had the year before. Our eyes met for a moment across the crowd. There was no mockery in his gaze now, no contempt. There was just a hollow, bewildered emptiness. I gave him a slight nod. He looked away, turning his face back into the shadows. The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools from the workshop. They went for pennies on the dollar. Men who had once envied Earl's state-of-the-art shop now bought his wrenches and socket sets with somber faces as if they were handling relics. Then came the big machinery, the Gleaner Ale combine, the one that had cost over $100,000 just a few years before, sold for $30,000 to an out-of-state salvage dealer. The John Deere 4630, Earl's pride and joy, the symbol of his modern empire, rolled onto the block. The auctioneer started the bidding at $20,000. Silence. He dropped it to $15,000. More silence. The farmers stood with their hands in their pockets, their eyes on the ground. No one could afford it, and even if they could, it felt wrong, like dancing on a grave. Finally, a voice from the back, a dealer from Missouri, bid $5,000. The auctioneer tried to work the price up, but there were no other takers. "Sold," he said, his voice flat, for $5,000. A machine that represented the pinnacle of farming technology, sold for less than the cost of its engine repair. The last item to be sold was the land. It was offered in 2 parcels, the original 160 acres Earl had inherited, and the 160 acres next to me that he had bought from the Miller estate. The auctioneer described its flat, fertile expanse, its high yield potential. He didn't mention the eroded topsoil or the lack of waterways. The bidding was slow, hesitant. The bank had a reserve price on it, and the bids weren't getting close. The banker stood by the auctioneer's truck, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim impatience. They took a short break. I walked away from the crowd, over to the line fence that separated my property from his. I looked out over the 160 acres he had cleared. The scars from the big bulldozers were still visible. It was a barren, wind-swept place. But the soil was fundamentally good. It just needed to be healed. My father's voice echoed in my head. "Don't look at what a thing is. Look at what it can be." I walked back to the auctioneer's stand. The banker was talking to the auctioneer in low, urgent tones. They started the bidding again on the 160-acre parcel bordering my farm. "All right, folks, let's try this one more time," the auctioneer called out, his voice weary. "What am I bid for 160 acres of the finest farmland in Pike County?" His words hung in the cold air. The crowd was silent. They were all broke, all scared. The land was a liability, a trap. I raised my hand. "I'll bid," I said. My voice was clear and steady. Every head turned toward me. The auctioneer squinted. "I'll bid $300 an acre." A gasp went through the crowd. It was a lowball offer, an insultingly low price compared to what it had been worth 5 years ago. But it was a real bid, a cash bid. I had spent the last decade saving, living frugally, putting my money in the bank instead of in machinery. The banker huddled with the auctioneer. I could see him doing the math in his head. $48,000. It was a fraction of what Earl owed on it, but it was more than they were likely to get from anyone else that day. A bird in the hand. The banker gave a short, sharp nod. "I have a bid of $300 an acre," the auctioneer announced, a flicker of life returning to his voice. "Do I hear 325? 310? Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the machine shed. No one else was going to bid. They couldn't. "Sold!" the gavel cracked. "To Silas Blackwood for $300 an acre." I didn't buy it to gloat. I bought it because it needed me. I bought it because I knew how to fix it. Life settled into a new pattern after that. The farm crisis didn't end overnight, but the worst was over. Slowly, things began to turn around. The community had been humbled, changed. The talk in the coffee shop was no longer about who had the biggest tractor or the newest combine. It was about interest rates, crop rotation and soil conservation. Men who had once laughed at my terraces now stopped me on the road to ask how to build them. I never preached. I just told them what I had done and what my father had taught me. I spent the next 5 years healing Earl's old farm. The first thing I did was bring the HD7 across the fence line. It felt like a homecoming for the old machine. I spent a whole summer not planting, not harvesting, but just moving dirt. I rebuilt the waterways that Earl's crew had filled in. I carved long, graceful terraces into the gentle slopes, just like I had on my own land. I planted a windbreak of pine and cedar trees along the north edge of the property. I was putting the land back together. Earl and his wife lost everything. They moved into a small rental house in town. For a while, he tried selling insurance, but his heart wasn't in it. One day, I ran into him at the hardware store. He looked tired, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes. We stood in awkward silence for a moment in the aisle with the nuts and bolts. "I hear you're fixing up my old place," he said, his voice quiet. "Just trying to stop the dirt from blowing into the next county," I replied. He nodded, looking down at his worn-out boots. "You were right, Silas. I see that now. I was farming the bank account, not the land. I borrowed so much money, I forgot how to fix anything myself. When that turbo went out, that was the beginning of the end. I was helpless." He looked up at me. "If you ever need a hand, someone to run a tractor, I'm available." "I could use some help this fall during harvest," I said. "I'll pay a fair wage." A flicker of his old pride returned. "I'll give you a fair day's work for it." And he did. Earl worked for me for the next 10 years, right up until he retired. We never became close friends, but a quiet, profound respect grew between us. He ran the combine, and I ran the grain cart. Sometimes, working late into the night under the bright harvest moon, we'd sit on the tailgates of our pickups, sharing a thermos of coffee, and we'd just talk about the weather, about the markets, about the old days. We never spoke of the auction again. We didn't have to. I never married. The farm was my wife and my child. My legacy was written in the contours of the land. By the time I was 60, my original 80 acres and the adjoining 160 were a single, seamless landscape of sustainable, healthy land. The stone walls I had built were covered in moss, and the pond was a sanctuary for ducks and geese on their long journey south. The farm was a patchwork of green and gold, held together by the stitches of my terraces and windbreaks. My nephew, my sister's boy, started helping me out in the summers. He was a good kid, smart, with a quiet curiosity. He loved the old machines. One hot afternoon, we were in the workshop, and he was looking at the HD7, which now sat in a place of honor at the back of the barn, retired from heavy service, but still started up once a month. "Uncle Silas?" he asked, running his hand over the faded orange paint of the big fuel tank. "Why do you keep this old thing? It's so loud and slow. You could buy a new one with air conditioning and a radio." I shut off the welder I was using to repair a cultivator shovel and pulled my helmet off, wiping the sweat from my brow. I walked over and stood beside him, placing my own hand on the warm steel of the old Dozer. "This machine," I said, my voice a little hoarse, "is a reminder. It reminds me that the things everyone else calls junk might just be the most valuable things you'll ever own. It reminds me that true wealth isn't about how much you can borrow. It's about how much you can build with your own 2 hands." I looked out the big barn door, across the fields that stretched to the horizon, the land that I had saved, that had saved me in return. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the wind rustled the leaves of the deep green corn. "Your granddad, my father, he told me once. Don't look at what a thing is. Look at what it can be. That goes for a pile of rust, and it goes for a piece of land. It goes for a person, too. You remember that? The boy nodded, his eyes wide with understanding. He looked from me to the dozer, and then out at the land, and for the first time, I think he saw it all not just as a farm, but as a story. A story of failure, of survival, and of the quiet, unyielding power of betting on yourself when the whole world is telling you you're a fool. And in the silent, sleeping heart of the old iron beast, I knew that story would live on.